Far Cry 5 and Far Cry New Dawn are very different from what we're used to in a Far Cry game. The series really took a more mainstream approach with these games, with the mute protagonist, and in the case of New Dawn, a bunch of RPG elements. Neither of these games are my favorite in the Far Cry series, yet both still have their moments where the games are a lot of fun and quite enjoyable. And since these two are the newest of the Far Cry series, I thought why not compare them and determine which game is better. If you are unfamiliar with how this series works, I take two games and score them on several different categories, which I will display on screen, and whichever game I feel does better in said category will be awarded a point, and the game with the most points by the end wins. So without further ado, Far Cry 5 versus Far Cry New Dawn. Our first category is the story, and in case you're unaware, New Dawn's story is a sequel to Far Cry 5. So if you are going to be getting New Dawn, it is very important that you play 5 first. But anyway, our first point is the protagonist. Oh man, this is normally the part where I would compare the main characters, talk about their personalities, development, etc. But you see, Far Cry 5 and New Dawn decide to skip this part when making the game, so can I take off a point from both games? Yeah, there we go, that's better. Alright, well luckily the developers didn't forget the antagonist part, because in Far Cry 5 we have Joseph Seed, and in New Dawn we have Mickey and Lou. I think this is a very easy point because Mickey and Lou are pretty poor antagonists. They just really aren't all that intriguing to watch, and them compared to other antagonists, and in this case compared to Joseph, they are below average for the series at best. Joseph isn't my favorite antagonist of the series either, that title will forever remain to Voss, but I still liked Joseph. I thought he was kinda creepy and a little mysterious, and whenever he talks to you, you pay attention. Unlike Mickey and Lou, where they almost have me falling asleep in half the scenes. Another thing I really like about Joseph is that he doesn't necessarily feel like the bad guy. I love when games kinda make you question if the villain is actually a villain. They did this with Pagan Min in Far Cry 4, who was just way more likable than the quote-unquote good guys, and it's something very similar with Joseph. He just had this religious faith that really just makes you want to side with him, so this is an easy point for Far Cry 5 in my opinion. The next point I'd like to talk about is plot. Now for the record, I think the plot is pretty weak in both games. In Far Cry 5, your character, the deputy, is sent to Hope County to arrest Joseph Seed and stop his cult, and then like every Far Cry game, something goes horribly wrong and you're stuck on a large map with the big bad guy. Far Cry 5 has you slowly work through all of Joseph Seed's siblings before you get to him, which I think the idea is good, but the execution and repetitiveness is really apparent after you complete a few regions, and there's not a whole lot of variety to it. The plot is interesting, but it's really missing that compelling motivation and incentive to progress that I feel a lot of the other Far Cry games had, Far Cry 3 especially. New Dawn is quite different in its structure. Instead, you're kinda just running around as a superhero, and you don't have a real agenda. I don't know, the plot just felt a lot less focused and a bit more messy than 5. Not to mention the plot is so short that it really doesn't allow much time to build its villains and characters, and overall the ending feels a bit rushed, so I'm giving this point to Far Cry 5. The last thing in the story I want to talk about is pacing. Pacing is a big problem I feel for a lot of large open world games, and Far Cry 5 is definitely a game that struggles with its pacing, and it's mostly because for each new region and villain you have to take down, you are given like this progression bar until you reach the final fight, which I not only think is a little immersion breaking, but it also makes the game's missions feel more like a checklist rather than a cohesive story arc. Also, one of my biggest annoyances with this game is once you reach a set point in the region progression bar, you'll get hunted and kidnapped by the villain, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, and I think this really kills the momentum and pacing of the game and halts it to a slow crawl. New Dawn doesn't have this system, thank God, but its pacing certainly isn't flawless either. Like I said earlier, the game is way too short and you progress through it way too fast. There's only like 22 short missions, and that is not nearly enough to satisfy the full dollar price tag or give enough substance to the story. Again though, Far Cry 5 I feel has a bit more issue in its pacing, so I'll just give this point to New Dawn. The combat in Far Cry 5 and New Dawn took some interesting innovations. What was one of my complaints in my Far Cry 5 review was that I felt Far Cry 5 did a poor job of introducing new gameplay mechanics as you progress through the game. You're pretty much given everything all at once, and if not then, you quickly get these new mechanics through the skill tree, like the chain takedowns as an example. I think previous Far Cry games did a much better job of layering the new mechanics and placing them in strategic spots in the game, so every time you are about to get bored of the combat, you suddenly have a new takedown or mechanic, or maybe you get a wingsuit or something that drastically improves the experience. But with Far Cry 5, the combat gets dull and more grindy as you progress, and by the time I was like 30 hours in, I was starting to get pretty tired of it, and Far Cry 5 being as massive as it really is doesn't do the combat any favors. The combat is really missing that flair and shake-up that a lot of games like this offer. Far Cry New Dawn clearly understood this much better, in large part thanks to the special abilities you unlock later in the game that completely changes the way you play and makes the combat a little arcadey but a ton of fun. Launching an AI 30 feet in the air with a punch, or double jumping like 100 feet in the air and raining death from above is so much fun to pull off. I really enjoyed the abilities. Far Cry New Dawn also had a lot of really fun, unique weapons I enjoyed, like the saw launcher or slingshot. There's so much personality and flavor in this game that it really shows in the combat. Granted, it's not all good. I really didn't like how enemies become damage sponges, and I didn't like the RPG health bars, along with the star difficulties that made some parts of the map really hard to fight in, but it still did a much better job of keeping me engaged combat-wise, so I'm going to give this point to Far Cry New Dawn. Stealth is another very similar deal in my opinion. Far Cry 5 does a good job of giving you freedom of approach and equipping you with creative ways to stealth kill. You can use suppressed weapons, a bow and arrow, and you can even throw melee weapons or use a gun for hire. But Far Cry New Dawn has all of that too, with the added abilities like Ghost, and I also just really prefer the knife takedowns from Far Cry New Dawn. It may seem like a weird thing to point out, but I largely prefer the brutal knife takedowns. They're so badass and really increase that satisfying feeling whenever you get a stealth kill. So once again, this point goes to Far Cry New Dawn. Customization is an easy point for me. One thing I really don't like about Far Cry New Dawn is how much they made customization practically non-existent. There is no gun customization in New Dawn. The most you can do is craft and upgrade weapons. Things like scopes, mags, and even weapon skins you have no control over. I really didn't like the crafting system the game relies on so heavily either. I much prefer the traditional system like in Far Cry 5 where you can purchase guns and shops and customize it however you see fit. Vehicle customization is also way better in Far Cry 5, and really the only thing I can really give New Dawn is that your clothing customization is actually a little more significant since you can actually see your character after clearing an outpost, but other than that, Far Cry 5 dominated customization, so it's an easy point for Far Cry 5. Far Cry 5 and Far Cry New Dawn have pretty much the same open world. Or should I say New Dawn has a small portion of Far Cry 5's open world that's been reskinned with lots of bright, vibrant colors, and lots of abandoned and destroyed buildings that you could once see in Far Cry 5. The smaller world from Far Cry New Dawn doesn't bother me a whole lot because the game is much smaller than Far Cry 5, and if New Dawn had the entirety of Far Cry 5's map, it would just be way too big. New Dawn's focus is in a smaller, denser map with a few outposts scattered, a home settlement system, expedition missions that take place on different levels, and a lot of random quicktime events once you're traversing the world. New Dawn's world doesn't have as much what would seem like empty space as Far Cry 5, but there is just so much more you can do and explore in Far Cry 5. There's way more side missions, more outposts, multiple regions, each with different landscapes and environments, along with a handful of quicktime events and random things to do like blowing up silos or shrines. Far Cry 5's world is chock full of exploration and world activities to do, and I really enjoy having that freedom to tackle it how you want. However, the post-game is very lacking in side content, and I definitely prefer New Dawn's take on Outpost Master, where you can replay outposts at any time you want and actually get materials and rewards for each time you do. Meanwhile, in Far Cry 5, you must complete them all first before you are even allowed to replay them. However, I can't deny the fact that Far Cry 5 has way more to do, and the attention to detail it puts into side story threads, some of them are very memorable, like helping this guy go to an alien world, so I'm giving this point to Far Cry 5. Immersion is a bit of a tough one. Far Cry 5 is extremely immersive. They really nailed sound design in this game. Wherever you go up to an outpost, you can hear enemies talking to each other in the distance, faint music playing, and one of the seed members speaking over a radio. The car radio in this game is fantastic, and Far Cry 5's world does a great job of drawing you in. It's really a game where you can get lost and forget about the outside world, because the world from the game feels so lively. It feels like a living, breathing world, and while it certainly isn't perfect, and Montana may not be the most interesting location for a game world, I certainly still enjoyed it. Far Cry New Dawn, of course, is pretty similar, but I don't know, I just didn't get that same feeling from it. The smaller world with not much variety in its environment was very noticeable, and it kind of just feels like a worse version of the Far Cry 5 world. It feels more restricted, there's not even nearly as much to explore and traverse, and by the end of the game, you've pretty much seen all you're going to see. Meanwhile, when I originally finished Far Cry 5, there was still a good portion of the world that I hadn't even explored yet, so this is another easy point for Far Cry 5 in my opinion. Graphics is a hard one to decide. I don't know about you guys, but I really don't see much of a difference in graphics. In fact, really the only thing that changes from Far Cry 5 to New Dawn is the saturation levels. New Dawn is very bright and colorful, but in terms of actual graphics, I really don't see a difference, so I'm just gonna give a point to both games. Now, performance isn't really a matter of opinion, but it can certainly vary. Now, just from testing the games through benchmarks, there's not a massive difference, but a problem I noticed with Far Cry New Dawn is that there are a lot of frame drops in this game. I'm not exactly sure why, maybe when there's a lot of enemies around, or maybe it's because the game has a hard time keeping up with the faster paced movement and combat. I'm not really sure what it is, but Far Cry 5 ran much more consistently on my PC, so performance is gonna go to Far Cry 5. This brings us to the final point, soundtrack. This one is a no-brainer for me, but obviously this point is completely personal preference. These games have completely different styles of soundtrack though. Far Cry 5 goes for this more ambient, religious, inspired country music, lots of choir, all that. I don't even like country music, but I love this soundtrack. Meanwhile, New Dawn really gives off this post-apocalyptic feel, which is great, that perfectly fits the atmosphere of the game. But Far Cry 5, man, it's rare I say a soundtrack is the best part of a game, but in Far Cry 5's case, I certainly think that's true. And it's not just like a few songs, no, the whole soundtrack is a masterpiece. It perfectly conveys the setting and atmosphere. I just love it so much. It's honestly one of my favorite video game soundtracks, so this point for me goes to Far Cry 5. So this leaves us with a final score of Far Cry 5 7 and Far Cry New Dawn 3, leaving Far Cry 5 as our winner and earning the title of the better game. Obviously this video is entirely my opinion, and if you feel New Dawn is the better game, feel free to say why down in the comments. Also, feel free to comment what comparison video you would like to see next. I've already made a lot of them for the Far Cry series. If you haven't checked them out already, we're talking Far Cry 4 versus Far Cry 5, 4 versus Primal, Far Cry 3 versus 4. Yeah, there is a lot of them. I'll leave the links for those in the description in case you want to check them out. If you enjoyed the video, dropping a like and subscribing to the channel really does help me out and motivates me to continue making videos. So if you liked the video, I'd really appreciate that. Thanks for watching and have a great day, Assassins. Well,